Steve Hricko wasn't exactly the romantic type. He didn't do flowers, didn't plan date nights, and according to his wife, Kimberly, he had barely even looked at her in the last year. So, when he suddenly booked a romantic getaway for Valentine's Day at the Harbor Town Resort, everyone was surprised, especially Kimberly. Maybe it was a last-ditch effort to save their failing marriage. Maybe he had something else in mind. Because by the next morning, someone would be dead, and no one knew who to blame. And for a while, no one knew who the real monster was. Steve and Kimberly had been together for nearly a decade. They had an 8-year-old daughter, a house, and a life that, from the outside, seemed great. But things between them had changed. Steve had pulled away. Kimberly said he was distant, disinterested, and more like a roommate than a husband. She enjoyed being social and getting out of the house, but Steve preferred quiet time at home, alone. Then, one December, Kimberly began having an affair. The man was 10 years younger, charming, and a Marine. They met at a party through mutual friends, and their connection was instant. She told people he was everything Steve wasn't: affectionate, exciting, and passionate. Kimberly felt like she finally found the love she had wanted so badly. That's why just 2 weeks later, she told Steve she wanted a divorce. He begged her to stay and promised he would change. Steve started writing her long love letters and suddenly became more affectionate than ever. To most people, that would have been a good thing, but Kimberly hated it. She told friends he followed her around like a lost puppy, and that the thought of being intimate with him made her physically ill. And then, in early February, Steve did something that caught everyone off guard. He planned a romantic weekend away, a private suite at a cozy resort, and a murder mystery dinner. Just the type of weekend Kimberly loved. Kimberly didn't know what to think. Steve had never done anything like this before, and with everything that had happened in the last few months, something about it felt off. Still, she went along with it. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, they checked into cabin 506 at the resort. It was nice, secluded, quiet, perfect for rekindling a marriage. Steve even ordered a bottle of champagne, which was also strange since he was never much of a drinker. That night, they got dressed up and went to the murder mystery dinner, where the plot revolved around a groom being poisoned on his wedding night. Kimberly enjoyed the show, but Steve, he barely reacted. He seemed detached and distracted throughout the dinner, and wasn't interested in solving the mystery at all. After dinner, they went back to the room. Later that night, guests in the suites nearby heard raised voices coming from cabin 506 around 11 p.m. Then, silence. At 1:20 a.m., Kimberly walked into the lobby and said, "I need to speak to someone who works here." She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked. She was just calm. The night manager approached Kimberly and asked how she could help. Kimberly looked her in the eyes and casually said, "I think my room is on fire." Shocked by her lack of urgency, resort staff rushed to help, asking for her room number, but she didn't immediately give it. She just stood there, watching them frantically check the records. It was like she was in shock from whatever had happened in her room. When staff and other guests reached cabin 506, thick black smoke was pouring out from the door. Inside, they found Steve, dead. His body was on the floor, covered in burns, positioned between the two twin beds. Kim told investigators that Steve had been drinking all throughout dinner, and after they went back to their cabin, he had become aggressive with her. Things had eventually calmed down, and Kim went to bed. The initial theory was that he had been drunk, dropped a lit cigar, and accidentally started the fire. The case was shaping up to be nothing more than a tragic accident. But then the autopsy came back, and suddenly, everything changed. Steve hadn't been drinking. His blood alcohol level was 0.00, not a drop of alcohol in his system. And there was no soot in his lungs, which meant he had been dead before the fire even started. At that moment, investigators realized they were dealing with something much bigger than a drunken accident. This was a murder. It turns out Kimberly had been planning this for months, and she had done everything to make sure Steve looked like the bad guy. Complaining to her friends about how distant he was, and how obsessive he had become once she asked for a divorce, and how weird this sudden romantic getaway was. She wanted people to believe she was the victim, that she had been stuck in a marriage with a man who had finally snapped. Kimberly worked at a hospital as an operating room technician, which gave her access to highly dangerous drugs. One of them was succinylcholine, a muscle relaxant that paralyzes the body while keeping the person fully conscious until they stop breathing. And that's what she used on Steve that night in the cabin. Once they were back in their suite, Kimberly injected an unsuspecting Steve with the muscle relaxer and stood by while it took effect. Steve had been completely aware of what was happening. He just couldn't move. Then, she set the fire to cover her tracks. Kimberly had planted cigars near his body, hoping it would look like a careless mistake. She even left the resort for 2 hours, later claiming she had been driving around lost and had returned to the room on fire. By the time she walked into the lobby and casually said, "I think my room is on fire," she already knew Steve was dead. And she was about to collect $450,000 in life insurance, or so she thought. Even though she believed she had planned out the murder with surgical precision, Kimberly had made one critical mistake. She talked too much. She had bragged about her plan to friends, saying she was trapped in her marriage and that divorce wasn't an option. She even joked about putting Steve to sleep, a comment she had made to a co-worker months before the murder. The moment her friends heard Steve was dead, they went straight to the police. Investigators dug deeper and found everything. The missing hospital drugs, the staged scene, the cigars she had purchased herself weeks earlier. 3 months after Steve's murder, Kimberly Rico was arrested. During her trial, the jury didn't take long to come back with a verdict. Guilty with a sentence of life in prison and no chance of parole. Steve had planned a romantic getaway and booked the murder mystery dinner, thinking it would be a fun way of getting his marriage rekindled. But the real murder mystery, it happened after the show ended, and the man everyone thought was the villain was the victim all along.